Well, here we are now for the very next instalment of the White Line Fever podcast. Steve Mascord is with us. Jimmy Smith here in Sydney, Australia. Steve, where are you again?
I'm in London, Jimmy, and for those of you who are listening, consider yourself blessed because I recently on Netflix. We're all going through Netflix, and I recently really enjoyed the ZZ Top documentary. So I'm going for the Billy Gibbons look. I haven't shaved in a bit more than a month, and by the time lockdown's over, I may actually be mistaken in the street for a member of ZZ Top. So there you go.
That's a long-winded way of saying he's just got out of bed, I think. All right, well, we know a lot about what's happening in the NRL. We've been kept up to date all the time with Project Apollo, etc. Can you give us a snapshot of what's happening over in the UK? Are we any closer to getting Super League, the Championship, League One back on track, Steve?
Well, it's been, I think, 3 weeks since we last did this chat. And I don't have anything new to tell you as far as what's happening here in the UK. Although I must say, it was the early days of lockdown at that point, and I was maybe came across as a little bit critical of the British authorities as far as their level of communication. But the level of communication is fine. They're informing the clubs every week now. There's telephone hookups to the clubs, and I know Ralph Rimmer has been on a show like this very recently. We wrote about it on the website, his appearance on a show like this that Sky run. So there's no lack of communication, but there's just no movement, and the reason for that is that in this country they'll do what all the other sports do, and at the moment there's no movement at all. I think we've just probably they think maybe reached the peak of the COVID-19 in the UK.
Yeah.
The lockdown continues, and rugby league remains locked down as well.
And it must be noted too, of course, with the precautions that Australia took a lot earlier in relative terms to somewhere like the UK, that COVID-19 hasn't had the impact. It's been much more substantial, the impact, not just on day-to-day living and the lockdown and so forth, but certainly in contracting the virus, and of course in deaths as well. So that's to be noted.
Yeah, well, we're in London now, and we're on the fourth floor of an apartment building, and people here, it's not quite like Hong Kong or maybe some other cities, but it's very densely populated, and so unfortunately that leads to greater infections and greater danger. So the idea, like as Ralph Rimmer did say, no sport is going to strike out on its own and make a decision when it's going to return in this country. It's going to be led by the government. And equally, you don't want to be talking about coming back too much either, because the public opinion, is more, focused on people's health, not on sport. So again, there's that kind of like you talk about herd. They talk about herd immunity when this started in the UK. Well, there's sort of a herd mentality when it comes to sport and when it returns in this country.
Steve, how solvent are Super League, the RFL?
I don't know, but I do know that that they have asked the RFL for help, and of course you can't have two bodies from one sport asking. Sorry, the RFL have asked the government for help. You can't have two bodies from one sport going to the government. So this has led to some speculation that the RFL and Super League may, I guess you would say, recouple, de-divorce, and that there might be more of a unified front out of this. Certainly, the private equity groups and the banks, led to believe the NRL approached banks over here and are fairly advanced in discussions with loans for banks over here. Well, those same bodies will have entered discussions with the RFL and Super League about bridging loans and investment. And I guess the same conversations with Sky, the same conversations that have happened with Fox and Nine will be happening with Sky.
Just on that, am I right in saying Sky made a payment to Super League despite the fact there was no football being played?
That's right. Sky did make an initial payment, and there's another one at the end of May due, and we don't know whether that's going to be paid. intense speculation that it won't be, and that Sky, like Channel 9, will look to extend their deal with the game at favourable terms to them.
Yeah.
But again, I contacted Sky and tried to get a comment out of them, and there was a flat no comment on any negotiations with rights holders or with the people who grant them rights. So,
just on that, before we go any further, that Wigan jersey that you have on now, is that on at half price at Mascot Browns?
You're well trained, Jimmy. Unfortunately, this is the Steelers warm-up top from the. No, it is a Steelers warm-up top from 2018 when Wigan went out to Australia and played 2 games.
Oh, okay, yeah.
This size, they played one of them at Wollongong, obviously, and Steve Hampson and Andy Gregory, former Steelers players, and that was a connection. But this size, the large, is completely sold out worldwide, but we do have every other size, and it is half price. Getting some more sent over here to the UK, actually pretty popular at the moment. So Mascot Browns is because we're a sort of home business, barely a business really, more a hobby. So we're still operating, and actually we've been very busy.
Come on, Stephen, you're an entrepreneur now. That's how you've been described during the course of the week. So let's stick with that one. By the way, this is me repping my Salford City Reds, the pride of the city jersey from the year 2000, which absolutely love. Pride of place here in the jersey drawer in Sydney. Okay, we talked about the solvency of the league itself. What about the individual clubs? And I'd imagine it's a little bit like in Australia in the NRL, that there's the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, that's right. And the request for funding from the government is based on the fact that these clubs are the centre of their communities and that they provide a lot of services aside from a game every second Sunday. So based on that, all the clubs, I mean, for instance, Wigan, if I want to send an email to Wigan about merch, there's no one there. They're all furloughed. So, I looked at Huddersfield's shop last night and their merch store is closed. So no one's at work. They're all furloughed. So the idea of coming back is hopefully there'll be some government funding there to keep the clubs up and running. We were at the end of a TV cycle, and if the funding was to drop below a certain level, then the lower division clubs are going to get nothing. So the game was already staring down into the abyss a little bit. Whether this pause makes things worse or whether there's a way to make it better, we don't know.
Okay, there's a lot of talk around if the NRL does come back, and we've talked about the reasons why. The opportunities for players that are currently playing in Super League being able to come back to Australia or try Australia for the first time. You've got I think Blake Austin's been mentioned, Sonny Bill Williams and Israel Folau would be obvious targets as well, James Maloney as well. Do you see that happening at all, that if there is no football or limited football played in Super League, that they can come back and play in the NRL?
Yeah, I don't see the clubs releasing players. I mean, I know Toronto have already sort of knocked the Sonny Bill Williams idea on the head. Said he's contracted here and he'll be staying here until play resumes.
Have they sorted out what's happening payment wise with the players? I know as the NRL has done.
All the players, all the players have been asked to take pay cuts. There's a sliding scale, so the highest paid player, Sonny Bill Williams, has to take the biggest cut. Right. Whether, and there's also, it was quite embarrassing for Super League that it was came out in The Guardian that they'd also agreed that if a player was going to be obstinate and refuse to accept the pay cuts, that none of them would sign him, that they'd all basically lock players out. Now, in that circumstance, sure, if a player feels he's, I guess a player could use the breach of contract to get out of that contract and go to Australia if he was desperate and if the club was desperate to have him. But then again, in Australia, the players aren't getting 100% of their contracts, are they?
No.
So it's a tough situation. It's like, Callum Watkins received a compassionate release from Gold Coast because his father contracted COVID-19, and his signing was announced around the same time as players were getting their, pay cut information. So, and I believe Callum Watkins was happy to accept, coming into a new club, happy to accept the reduced terms. But nevertheless, you're signing new players at the same time as you're telling guys to take a pay cut. It's a tough juggling act.
Yeah, I think we had the similar situation with Tyson Frizzell announcing a 3-year deal with the Newcastle Knights. That this was pre the shutdown, and the NRL refused to register it because they didn't know what was going to happen. We still don't know what's going to happen from a salary cap point of view. We're not 100% sure. We think May 28, that's what everyone's working towards. So that'll be interesting to see whether we hit that target, which I think everyone's hoping that we do. What's it mean, though? Because I think everyone was a little bit excited about a kangaroo tour or a mini kangaroo tour that was happening at the end of this year. I know Mal Meninga was a big supporter of that. What impact is that going to have, given that we're hearing that Project Apollo is looking at missing only 3 rounds of footy and perhaps playing a grand final as late as November? Does that just mean no international football at the end of the season?
Yeah, it does. It does mean no international football at the end of the season. I know Sean Wayne has said he'd happily play, the New England coach, happily play an Ashes test on Christmas Day. There's no room for the internationals this year. The World Cup is next year. It would be horrible if, the World Cup was wiped out. And, there's plenty of people out there who say the World Cup, because of all the other sport on next year now, Euros, soccer, for instance, and the Olympics, they'll have to move the World Cup. But certainly, it's hard to see the Kangaroo Tour happening. And it was going to be the most complete Kangaroo Tour we've seen since 1994.
Yeah.
With the game against the Wolfpack in Toronto, some matches in France. Clubs, they were going to go back to playing Super League clubs. So it wasn't going to be a mini Kangaroo Tour. It's going to be as close as we can have in the modern world to a full Kangaroo Tour. And I just can't see any of it taking place now.
Yeah, disappointing, isn't it? Back closer to home, from my point of view, your ex-home, as a former journalist who's worked at Fairfax, who's worked at News Limited, the two broadcasters of the league are, of course, Fox Sports, owned by News Limited, and Channel 9, which is owned by Channel 9, who own Fairfax. Now, are you interested to hear, read, see the way that the two daily newspapers in Sydney have been reporting what's happening, sometimes behind closed doors? Sometimes I'm sure that the information is getting out that people would prefer to stay behind closed doors. What's been your take on the way that the negotiations between Patrick Delaney of Fox and Hugh Marks of Nine and Peter V'landys and his team at the NRL a restarting of the competition and a new broadcast deal?
Yeah, it's a big question, both in length. It was a big question, but it's also a big question as far as complexity. I'm certainly very interested that basically the reporters at the Sydney Morning Herald are being fed information from Nine and equally at News. It's the same. And Channel 9 don't seem to want the rugby league to come back, or at least they don't want to have to pay their bills as far as to pay for the rugby league. And even before we recorded this program, Jimmy, there was a comment from Channel 9 saying that it was overly optimistic, May 28, and blah 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 blah, and then News reported that as basically Nine trying to sabotage rugby league. And one of the big kind of furphies I read repeated everywhere is that the Premier League only has 150 employees. Why does the NRL need 450? Well, the Premier League does not run soccer in the UK. The Premier League is a marketing department for the top division. There's 69 professional clubs, and soccer in this country is run by the FA, and they have 728 employees. The NRL is not just running that central competition. Obviously, that central competition wins most of the funding. So, sure, the NRL clubs could have they think that the NRL should just be an organisation to look after them because they create the wealth. But then who pays for junior development? Who pays for the whatever it is? 500,000 kids or whatever. I believe up 13 aside, it's down to about 170,000 kids around the country. But the FA in this country runs the disciplinary and the umpires and all those sort of things that are the boring things that people don't think about. It costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of resources to run an entire sport in the country. And Premier League is not representative of that at all. Same as Super League, in our sport, Super League is a marketing department for the top division only. So that is a furphy, absolute furphy to compare the NRL to Premier League. As far as the reporting is concerned, it obviously is a worry that the two major rights holders are also the companies that put out newspapers in every Australian city. So it's difficult, even if the reporters are doing their best to be impartial. You're only getting information from one side. You're getting a call from upstairs with some background, and you're not getting a call from across the road from background, or they're not returning your calls. So,
how overt is that in situations like that? Is it presumed? Is it assumed by the author? Is it actual management coming down and saying, "Hey, you better take a look at this"? How does that play out?
Well, I've never been in the position where I've had management ever in my entire career, where I've had management put pressure on me to report something in a certain way. But you know what a good story is. You have news sense. And if the good story comes from inside your own building or it comes from outside your own building, it's still a good story. The other thing is, Jimmy, no one gives you information without a motivation.
Right.
So it's your job to sift through their motivations and take the motivations into account when you write your story. So, it doesn't matter if it's a guy stubbing his toe at training. The guy who's rang you and told you has got a reason to ring you and tell you. So, you have to sift through his motivation in the way you report it. So as far as it being overt, as I said, I know at Fairfax, if you look at, and I've recently been going through all of, the Fairfax reporting during the Super League war, and it was a constant source of annoyance to the ARL that Fairfax didn't take their side. Again, that Fairfax covered Super League equally. And so, I'm not sure that there's an overt, the reporters are sitting there going, I've got to push Channel 9's line. But if they're only getting their mail from Channel 9 because Hugh Marks or Hugh Marks' representative is actually ringing them and giving them a good story that's going to be a front page or back page splash, then they're going to report it. As far as the news limit is concerned, I don't know. I worked there for 3 years. I never had anyone from management ring me up. I got the impression that the company's view was shared by the people I worked with in a lot when it happened to a lot of issues, and that if I wrote something that was against the company's view, it may not get as good a run as a story that that was in line with the company's view. But I never received sort of pressure to write things a certain way. I just kind of thought that a story that was favourable to the company's view might get a bigger run than one that wasn't. I got that impression. But
okay. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. I want a couple of last things to finish with. The final one will be Todd Greenberg and his exit. Of course, you had your Jerry Maguire moment, and it was all inspired.
It was the opposite. Show me the no money.
But before we get to that, give us your thoughts on what does the game of rugby league look like in England in 1 year's time? That depending on what happens, of course, club survival, RFL back with Super League. What do you think league in the UK is going to look like in 12 months' time?
Well, the big thing that's supposed to be happening next year is that, I think from anyone's point of view, as far as being radical, is Ottawa coming into League One and New York beginning to play games. You've got to wonder in this environment how a club like New York, particularly, are going to get funding, are going to get sponsorship and investment to be able to fulfil that promise. Ottawa are, plugging away at the moment. I did see a story that Eric Perez said that it's business as usual. Really, we're lucky that we didn't start this year, and we don't have all those overheads. So I think so. I think there is some argument that we may go back to 2 divisions and not 3, and that some of the clubs might fall off the bottom of the League One. Here in London, London Scholars have lost their owner and chairman, and they are battling on. They're going to continue with the other guys who are involved, but the main financier is gone. So you'd have to go, well, will they become a very good amateur club? As an example. So I think in a year from now we will have pretty much what we had at the start of this year, I think. But that depends on the government funding. But it will look a little bit different, and perhaps. A very interesting question was asked by Dave Woods of the BBC of Mark Evans, who former CEO of Melbourne Storm, English guy, a rugby union background. If rugby league goes back to being part-time, would that be so bad in this country? And Mark Evans said, yeah, it would. He said, telecasters, sponsors, investors, they'd be turned off by that. And you would just have, basically Super League would become what the championship is, which is, very much spectator based, very, very local, very little national publicity, all that sort of stuff. So we hope that doesn't happen. We hope that Super League stays full time. The Wolfpack, everyone's asking about the Wolfpack. My understanding is that it's tough times, but they'll be back with everybody else. They're able to continue. So I think in a year's time we have, maybe what we had at the start of this year, with a bit of a haircut, which
right.
I'll also have one by then.
So. Please. And finally, Todd Greenberg. I think I don't think it shocked a lot of people. The timing may have been caught a few people by surprise. We've also had Raylene Castle from Rugby Australia, who has also resigned. Intense media speculation and scrutiny, and you could even say even stronger than that, for both those leaders of their respective sports in this country over the last, well, certainly from Todd Greenberg's point of view, the last 2 or 3 months. What was your take on Todd Greenberg's resignation? And part 2, how do we remember the Greenberg era?
I obviously was quite outspoken when Todd was appointed, because the Ben Barber stuff happened immediately before, and I felt there was a degree of accountability there that wasn't taken. It was surprised that the NRL Integrity Unit found that appointment could go ahead. But having said that, I haven't really had enormous problems with the policies of the NRL since Todd was appointed. I liked the push towards inclusiveness. I think the bunker, people hate it, but it was necessary, and it does its job pretty well. I think Peter V'landys comes across as somewhat autocratic, and it was probably any CEO would have had to deal with that sort of micromanaging and that oversight from the new chairman, and it would be difficult for any CEO to deal with. So people who follow the politics of the game in Australia much more closely than I predicted this outcome, pretty much. So from that point of view, the one thing with Todd, I would say, is that the public really didn't get to know him, because, I came up through an era, and so did you, Jimmy, where the CEO of the NRL, New South Wales Rugby League, ARL before them, would call reporters back at 5 o'clock every day. And, we knew Ken Arvison, we knew John Quayle, we knew David Gallop, who was on the evening news apologising for players' misbehaviour every night. And we knew David Moffat. He rode his bicycle onto the set of the footy show. You know what I mean? We didn't really know Todd Greenberg because, he was surrounded by advisors, and we had this process of spokesman and off the record backgrounding of reporters, where there was plausible denial, where you couldn't quote anyone saying that this would happen. So when it didn't happen, there was no one to blame. I like the fact that Peter V'landys appears to answer calls, and he's quoted in the paper one-on-one interviews every day at the moment. So I think that's a real positive. And I think maybe, if Todd had been more confident to be the front man, then maybe he might have got more public sympathy than he did in the end, because alas, we barely knew him. So,
Yes.
And again, the people who are being mentioned as his replacements, don't know much about, the public don't know much about them. You and I probably met them. We know them. We've got mutual friends, but the people maybe watching and listening, they don't know much about Andrew Abdo as a person. So let's hope that the trend we're seeing at the moment of the front man actually being up front is something that, regardless of who comes into Todd's job, is continued.
Yeah, my 2 bobs worth on that is that, question marks about Todd with what happened at the Bulldogs. And I always felt that rightly or wrongly, it hamstrung Todd a little bit in certain areas of governance within the game, most notably around the player managers. I think that was a concern that a lot of people held, and I don't know whether that was correct, that assumption, or not, but it certainly appeared that way, especially following Parramatta in 2016. I think the financial outcomes that the NRL find themselves in with the no future fund, that they did start putting money away in a future fund and then accessed it because they had a $30 million shortfall during the course of 1 year. They haven't paid the player superannuation that they said they would, and they've gotten around that on a technicality that it has to be there by the end of this broadcast deal. All of that is unacceptable. For the sake of naming a $30 million profit, why don't you just put the $10 million in the player superannuation fund? That sort of stuff is frustrating, and they're oversights. And I think one of the strengths of Peter V'landys is financials. So I think that's a good thing from the NRL's point of view. As far as the successor goes, I know there's a lot of names being thrown into the hat. Phil Gould won't do it. Shane Richardson's name's been thrown up by Russell Crowe. So been there, done that a little bit, I would have thought, with Richo. Andrew Abdo, I think, I've met Andrew a couple of times. He's done very well commercially. He doesn't know rugby league like other people know rugby league, which some people might find as a positive. I don't. But his business acumen is widely accepted. And I think the way that Peter V'landys is, as you mentioned, so hands-on as a chairman, he didn't want the job himself, didn't want to be executive chairman. But the fact that he'd be able to go there for the next 2-3 years and guide Andrew Abdo through the initial stages of a CEO-ship, I think is actually not a bad outcome for the game. And it's a time when I think a lack of knowledge in the game will be accepted because of the influence of Peter V'landys. So for what it's worth, if they came out and said in 2 weeks' time, hey, we've done it, they won't do it in 2 weeks' time. They'll do a worldwide search and then find him down the corridor, which happens in a number of sports. But they'll do their worldwide search, and if they ended up at Andrew Abdo, I wouldn't be upset.
Fair enough, Jimmy. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm probably already done a plug for the shirt I'm wearing, but I'm doing a book at the moment about 1997. So I've spoken to David Gallup and Neil Whitaker and John Quayle, and it is a poison chalice in that a lot of the people who depart do so with a degree of bitterness, and they don't watch a game after they leave. They don't go to functions. They don't. It's so poisonous that it just completely burns away people's enthusiasm for the sport. And I guess if you don't have that level of enthusiasm to start with, and you've got less to lose. So, maybe it is good to not be, if you weren't standing on the hill at Leichhardt with a pie before you took the job, then you won't miss it if you're not doing it after you leave the job.
Any other commercial opportunities you'd like to exploit and expose at this point? You've got your jerseys, you've got the book coming out. Let's leave it at that.
Maybe I don't know what the book's going to be called or how much it's going to cost. So if you just send me $100 on PayPal when the book comes out, I'll give you a change. So
very good. Thank you, mate. Another episode of White Line Fever in the can. So well done on that. Stay safe over there in the UK, and we'll look forward to speaking in the future.
Good to talk again, Jimmy. Nice jersey.